Hello, everyone, and welcome back down here to the Gamer's Den with me, your host, Jordan, your master of lore and storyteller extraordinaire. Today, I have my littlest and most adorable co host, my junior master of lore and storyteller in training, Nora. Nora, go ahead and say hi to everybody. There you go, good job. Anyways, for today's going to be another relatively short episode, but it's a subject that I think can be kind of just lost, or maybe not even lost necessarily, so much as it just doesn't always necessarily occur right off the bat, and that is changing up the box standard settings that come with the various Dungeons and Dragons and Pathfinder books or anything like that. And this is going to more apply to your, as weird as it is to say, some more of your standard fantasy settings, where dwarves are good, upstanding, righteous, moral, very clan oriented, loyal to their high king, and take their oaths very seriously, and elves being specifically high elves. And for those of you that may not know the difference between, like, say, high elves, wood elves, and the like, high elves are like what you would see in, like what we have seen in Lord of the Rings, like Lord Elrond and his people. Those would be high elves, very noble, superior, highly intelligent, skilled, and very ancient people. Now, it's easy enough to go with these particular settings when you're playing in any of these fantasy styled or oriented games. It's real easy to pick up into, and everybody loves playing in them. Well, most everybody. I know I certainly do. I just love classic fantasy settings, something Tolkien-esque, not necessarily running around in Middle Earth. I don't know, but anything that you might find like in the Forgotten Realms setting or in the Pathfinder world setting, or hell, even the Rollmaster setting, as cheesy and 80s as a lot of the writing around that is. It's still a whole lot of fun and a really great time. But, like I keep saying in the show, it's good to mix things up a little bit from time to time. It keeps things interesting, and it presents a lot of what ifs. I mean, I know I'm certainly a fan of looking at and even thinking of alternate history things, like what if the Nazis had pursued a more Mediterranean strategy rather than sending their U-boats out into the Atlantic, or if they hadn't bothered doing that at all and used those resources to shore up their defenses along the coast, in particular on Normandy. Like if the D-Day invasion had stalled out, how much more crazy could things have potentially gotten? Or say Russia actually took the offensive and they jumped over the border into German territory during World War II, or if the US had just never gotten involved at all, what things would end up being different. And that really presents some interesting situations for you to throw at your players, is just by changing things up a little bit. Just going back with the elves example, changing them up is, well, changing any of the standard fantasy races is easy enough, but it's one of those things where if you make the change, you want to give it at least a decent amount of thought. Again, something I keep talking about a lot here on this show is a lot of thought and effort put into everything. Now, how much you want to put into it just really depends on you and your players and what exactly it is you're going for. But definitely, if you're changing up an entire culture or the culture for an entire race or species of people and creatures, give it a little bit of time, thought, and effort. One of the easiest ways to do this and simplify things is to try to find a like culture and match it up with the fantasy culture. For example, again, going with the high elves. High elves in a lot of fantasy settings, they're very magically oriented people. They're ancient, so they take a long view. They're slow to move and act on many things, but when they do act, it is decisive. And their age kind of lends them a certain sense of coming off as arrogant to younger, more short-lived races. And sometimes it is arrogance, sometimes it's just a matter of having lived longer and experienced more. They know what to do, and well, generally will know what to do. Thinking that they know what they're going to do produces a lot of interesting weaknesses that can be exploited, but that's covered in a lot of different fantasy books so already. But their famed horsemen, their famed sailors and navigators, it's easy enough to kind of change their culture a little bit by trying to find other real world cultures that exist that way. For example, for a sort of recentish setting, haven't played in it for a couple of months with my friends' kids, ran a game for them. I changed up the high elven culture a bit to where the elves were more like Polynesian Pacific Islander people, like the Maori. Great navigators, great sailors, but they're more of an island-based people. Not so much horsemanship involved for them there, but because they're embody more of this islander aspect, there's more ship-to-ship combat. They're like the Maori, they're great and aggressive warriors. They value a lot of tattoo artwork to display their mana, their strength. There's a whole deep and intricate culture within people's cultures like the Maori, and it's really interesting and fascinating stuff. But by focusing on that one particular aspect of the high elves that you typically see in a lot of fantasy settings, their fascination with the sea, traveling back home, paying special attention to the stars, and navigating their way around across the vast open oceans, it matches really well with that kind of island hopping Pacific kind of culture that we find in our own world. And just basing this fantasy race on that changed things up and made them a bit more interesting. They're a bit more of an aggressive people, definitely much more nomadic in their lifestyle and their outreach. They tend to look a little bit closer to, say, wood elves or wild elves, as depending on the setting or what your DM decides they like to go with. But changing up your standard fantasy races and tweaking their cultures just a little bit can produce enough of a unique difference to make your settings much more interesting to your players. It differentiates them from the stuff that comes standard in most of the books. Like most of the Dungeons and Dragons books are set pretty well and thoroughly within the Forgotten Realms setting. And don't get me wrong, I love Forgotten Realms. I love all the stories of Elminster, Drizzt Do'Urden, Artemis Entreri, all of those characters and all those settings like Kalimshan, Neverwinter, all of those places, just they're classics and they're fun to run around in. But it's also good to change things up. I mean, variety is the spice of life, so inject it into your settings a little bit and watch your players just light up as they dig into this new thing. It's absolutely fantastic when you come up with something that's even just a little bit different and has that mild aspect of just being, well, again, just different. It allows people to dig into something new. It creates that sense of wonder and investigation, and sets the players in a spot where, they don't automatically know what they're getting into right off the top of their heads. And, well, that part just comes back into metagaming. Again, it's best to try to nullify that as much as possible, but the problem is nobody can really fully eliminate how much they're metagaming, especially if the people you're playing with have been doing tabletop games for years. They know a lot of the ins and outs of the various creatures and monsters, demons, devils, angels, archons, all of these different things. They already know a fair bit about it. So, again, just tweaking things around just a little bit really does wonders for your settings and your storytelling, and it just adds a layer of depth to the world. Because, for example, if you extrapolate from that little tweak to the High Elves, making them more modeled off of a Pacific Islander culture, how has that set their interactions with the various other races? How has that set their interactions with humans, with dwarves, halflings? What are their views on half elves? Because they're not full elves, and so they can't quite live as long. They can't quite build up the same series of intricate tattoos that share the stories of their various victories and triumphs, that display their mana, their strength. And hello, do you want to chime in here? What do you have to say? Tell them all about it. Good stories there. Always good stories with this one. She's going to be an excellent storyteller when she gets older, or player if that's more her thing. But, anyways, it once you extrapolate from there, how and take a look at how these various cultures interact with one another. The Maori kicked the crap out of a lot of people. Like when the British first began invading where is it, the New Zealand area? Uh, should never try to remember stuff off the top of my head. But when the British came into contact with the Maori, it was during their age of colonial expansion and imperialism, and they tried to subjugate the area. But the Maori were pretty successful at fighting them off just because of the strength of their warriors and their warrior culture. They were real tough and really effective in combat, and they did this without gunpowder weapons, at least at first. They once they got a hold of them, they may have been a lower tech tribal culture at the time without access to gunpowder weapons, but once they were introduced to them, yeah, you can bet your ass they made use of them, and they made effective use of them when they got them. Not only were they capable warriors, but they were intelligent, and their intelligence allowed them to grasp onto these. Pardon me, grasp onto these tactical changes wrought by this advance and change in technology, and they were able to defeat this superior culture, this at least superior, more technologically advanced armaments. They were able to beat these people with these more advanced weapons, with these gunpowder weapons, and just kick them out of their area pretty effectively. It's actually an amazing read if you ever have the time to dig into it yourself. But suffice it to say, with this change and with this more aggressive action on part of the elves, this, at least in my mind, would mean that they're not quite so slow to act as their more traditional high elven counterparts would be. They're more likely to seize the initiative and try to exploit their advantages. Their centuries upon centuries, or in some cases millennia of experience, would lend itself well to this. So when it comes to interacting with any humans who who will definitely have less experience than them, and if these humans they interact with are aggressive with them, these elves will be more than likely to seize their opportunity and just jump all over them and start wiping the floor with them as quickly as possible. And, well, again, in my mind, because they're an island hopping kind of culture, great wayfarers and seagoers, well, this lends itself well to raiding, especially if the humans are settled more on coastal cities and towns, and they're situated in larger groups and populations. The elves, since they live so long, tend to reproduce a lot more slowly. But again, that just ties into why they'd focus more on a raiding kind of tactical deployment, kind of like what you would see the Finnish, Swedish, the Northmen of the Viking Age, the Vikingers going on their Viking raids. They'd pop in and out really quick, striking vulnerable areas on these lightning fast and very brutal raids on vulnerable targets. No reason why Pacific Islander based elves couldn't do the same thing. Just pop in and out really quick for these lightning quick raids, inflicting as much damage as they could, seizing whatever supplies they could to help even out the enemy advantages that they may have over them on the battlefield, and then apply their centuries of tactical discipline and ability to work together and function as highly experienced units could really, well, I could keep going on, obviously, but suffice it to say, thinking about how these little interactions would take place based off of these little tweaks to culture here and there can really do a lot for your world building and your storytelling overall. Well, that's about it for now as this example here. I mean, you could do, the options are limitless. I've always been fond of the idea of making hobgoblins modeled more after samurai culture, or even ancient Chinese culture, something a la the Romance of the Three Kingdoms period. And The hobgoblins certainly can produce the vast numbers required to replicate those kinds of armies, and they're by no means stupid either. They could easily be replicating some of those really intricate and crazy advanced tactics and unit deployments and formations and the like. And switching dwarves up too. Switching dwarves around, it wouldn't be too hard either, given their focus on oaths to the king and clan loyalty and everything. Be pretty easy to introduce just a slightly more bureaucratic aspect to them, to where everything's got to be routed through these different channels and proper levels of authority, and everything's properly investigated and audited, and it takes a long time, or at least relative to, say, a human lifespan and mindset, things may take a long time. But because, again, dwarves can live a couple of centuries, to them, it's going to take 3 weeks to process, or 3 months to process. Well, it's not a big deal. I mean, 3 months is definitely a while to wait, but it's a drop in the bucket for somebody that's going to live, 5 or 6 centuries. For a human being that may live 6 or 7 decades, that's waiting 3 months is painful. But again, just these little cultural tweaks and changes, things that fit or make sense, just with just a little bit of storytelling and world building on your part, will really do a lot of wonders for making your worlds that much more interesting. Anyways, I have been your host, Jordan, your master of lore and storyteller extraordinaire. With me is my most adorable co-host, junior storyteller in training, Nora. And if you liked our video today, please consider giving us a like and a subscribe. And if you do subscribe to the channel here, click the bell icon. That way you get notified the next time I bring you more great content here. Anyways, thank you all for your time. You guys have yourselves a good night.